All right, so welcome to another deep dive, you guys.
Yes, hello.
Today, we are going to be taking a look at a really interesting book, I think,
Okay.
called 40 Words for Sorrow by Giles Blunt.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this one.
Have you? Yeah.
I have, yeah.
So this is, it's a crime novel,
Okay.
and it features a really interesting character, Detective John Cardinal.
Mm-hmm.
And the setting is um, so well written
Yeah.
that I think it almost becomes like a character itself in the story.
Interesting.
So we're going to be looking at that.
Right.
The setting, um, specifically Algonquin Bay, Ontario.
Okay.
And then also we'll be talking a little bit about Detective Cardinal and what makes him so compelling as a protagonist.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into that.
Yeah, me too. And I think
Great.
that
Yeah.
one of the things that we'll uncover along the way is kind of the darkness that lies beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet town.
Ooh, I love that. A
And
little bit of secrets and darkness there.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, so you're saying that you've heard of this book?
I have, yeah, I've heard of it. I've seen it around,
Yeah.
I've heard people talking about it, but I've never actually gotten a chance to read it.
Okay, well, I'm excited for you to kind of hear a little bit about it and see what you think.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
One of the things that really struck me about this book was how the setting is so much more than just a backdrop.
Right.
You know, it's not just like, oh, this is where the story takes place.
Yeah.
It really becomes, like I said, almost a character itself.
Interesting.
And what are your initial thoughts on that? Like, what do you think makes a setting so powerful?
Well, I think when an author can really transport, like you said, it's not just a backdrop when you can really feel like you're there, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that comes from very specific sensory details,
Yeah.
not just telling us what it looks like, but, what it feels like, what it sounds like, even.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
Blunt does a really great job of that. Like he talks about the wind whipping the snow into these like icy needles
Oof.
and
Yeah.
the silence. You know how it's just so profound. It's almost like pressing down on you.
Right. And it's so interesting because silent, it's the absence of something, but he makes it feel like a presence,
Yeah. Yeah.
like something that's there, surrounding you.
It is. And I think that really contributes to this overall feeling of isolation,
Yeah.
that permeates the whole story.
Absolutely. And like you said, that bleeds into the characters and their interactions with each other.
It does. Yeah. It makes
Mm.
you wonder, what happens to people when they're constantly battling not only the elements, but each other.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because there's this feeling of being, trapped almost,
Yeah.
not just by the physical landscape, but by the social landscape as well.
Right. Yeah. And so this is where Detective John Cardinal comes in.
Oh.
He's the protagonist of the story, and he is tasked with solving this crime that takes place in Algonquin Bay.
Right.
What are your first impressions of Cardinal, just based on what I've told you so far?
Well, it sounds like he's got a lot on his plate,
He does.
Not only the case itself, but this oppressive setting and this, the feeling of isolation.
Right.
So I imagine he's got to be pretty tough,
Yeah.
to be able to deal with all that.
Yeah, he's definitely a complex character. He's very good at his job.
Okay.
Like, he's very intelligent. He's a brilliant detective,
Mm-hmm.
but he's also deeply flawed.
Okay.
He's haunted by some tragedies from his past,
Interested.
and that kind of carries with him, as he's trying to solve this case.
Right. So he's got his own personal kind of demons that he's battling as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that makes him really compelling as a character.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's not just a superhero who's, perfect in every way. It's somebody who's real, who's dealing with their own stuff
Right. Exactly. And I think that,
while also trying to do their job.
yeah, and it makes you wonder, do his personal struggles, like, do they help him solve the case?
Yeah.
Or do they hinder him?
Right. Does it give him insight into, the darker sides of human nature, or does it, make him make mistakes?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's something that Blunt explores really well throughout the book.
Okay, cool.
But, it's not just Cardinal that makes this story so interesting.
Right.
It's also the supporting characters,
Yeah.
the people that live in Algonquin Bay.
Yeah. The other inhabitants of this,
Exactly.
this isolated town.
And they're not just background noise,
Right.
They each have their own stories and their own secrets and their own motivations.
Right. So they're all fully fleshed out characters.
They are, yeah. Like, for example, there's a troubled teenager
Right.
who's struggling to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a grieving mother who's just desperate for answers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even a local police officer who has a hidden agenda.
Ooh, okay. So lots of suspects, lots.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and it just adds this. It
Intrigue.
does, yeah, it adds so many layers to the story. And it really contributes to this feeling that the town itself is like this living, breathing entity.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and speaking of layers,
Yeah.
let's talk about the plot, because I was hooked from the very beginning.
Okay.
I was constantly trying to figure out, like, what's going to happen next, who's responsible for this.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you haven't read the book, but can you talk a little bit about what makes a good crime novel?
Yeah.
What are some of the elements that you look for?
Well, I think you definitely need a good mystery, right? You need something that's going to keep you guessing.
Right.
I think it's good to have, believable characters, not just the detective, but all the people involved.
Yeah.
And I think also you need a good sense of pacing. You don't want to give everything away too soon, but you also don't want to drag it out,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Blunt is really good at that. Like, he slowly reveals clues and information.
Okay.
But he also throws in a lot of red herrings.
Yeah.
So you're constantly second-guessing yourself.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, it's really well done.
Yeah.
And what I thought was really interesting was that there are all these, like, subplots
Okay.
that seem kind of unrelated at first, but then they all kind of converge
Okay.
in this really satisfying way.
Yeah, I like that.
And it really adds to the complexity of the story.
Yeah.
So it's not just like a straightforward Hewed unit.
Yeah.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
But beyond just the suspense and the mystery,
Mm-hmm.
there are also these really profound themes that Blunt explores.
Okay, like what?
Things like loss and grief
Okay.
and the burden of secrets.
Yeah.
How they can really weigh on people.
Yeah.
And he does it in a way that's not like overly heavy or depressing,
Right.
but it's definitely thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you think about the impact that these things have on people's lives.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, everybody's got secrets, right?
Exactly.
And everybody's experienced loss at some point. So I think that's something that really, resonates with people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this book so powerful. It's not just entertainment.
Right.
It's something that can really stay with you.
Yeah, it makes you think.
Yeah, and so for anyone who hasn't experienced 40 Words for Sorrow,
Yeah.
I would highly recommend checking it out.
I might have to add it to my list now.
Yeah, I think you'd really enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's a really great example of crime fiction at its best.
Okay.
It's got a compelling plot.
Yeah.
It's got complex characters,
Mm-hmm.
and the setting is just so vivid and atmospheric.
Right.
It's really a great read.
Yeah.
So just to kind of wrap things up here,
Okay.
I want to leave our listeners with a thought.
Right.
We've talked a lot about how the setting is almost like a character itself. And I think that's really true. The isolation and the harshness of Algonquin Bay,
Mm-hmm.
it really influences the story in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I want you to think about how that landscape might actually mirror the internal struggles
Okay.
of the characters.
Okay.
Like Cardinal, for example.
Yeah.
He's dealing with all this, emotional baggage from his past.
Mm-hmm.
And the setting itself is kind of like a reflection of that.
Yeah.
It's
Tasting. Yeah.
it's cold, it's unforgiving, it's isolated.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really interesting parallel.
It is. Yeah.
So I'd love for you to kind of think about that as you're reading the book.
Yeah.
And see what other connections you can make between the setting and the characters.
I will. That's a really great point.
So this has been a really great deep dive.
It has. Yeah.
We've only scratched the surface of 40 Words for Sorrow.
Right.
But I hope that we've given you a little taste
Yeah.
of what makes this book so special.
Absolutely.
And hopefully you go out and check it out for yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.